Today we're going to be talking about the scientific method. So first, what is the scientific method? It's a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment in the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. So very complicated sounding definition, and while it was actually given the essentially terminology in the 17th century, scientific method has been happening long before then, because essentially all the scientific method is just when you have some kind of problem, it's the process that you go through mentally and physically to try and solve the problem, or really not even necessarily solve the problem, but just figure something out. So today we're going to go into the specific components of what makes up the scientific method. So the first thing is you start with some kind of observation. We usually think of observations as exclusively with sight, but really any of our senses can be an observation. So hearing, taste, touch, and smell, all of those things can be contribute to our observations that we have about the world. Okay? And then once you make an observation, you're going to have some kind of question come to your head or some kind of idea. And then once you have that idea, you're going to start making educated guesses or hypotheses. That's the plural of hypothesis about it. So again, a hypothesis, that's just an educated guess. You use your current knowledge or what you have observed already, and you try and guess what could happen or what would happen if something did this. It all depends on the situation you're looking at. Now, when you're making a hypothesis, it's got to be a very direct, clear-cut statement. And you have these things such as the null versus the alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is a statement about a population parameter. We test the likelihood of this statement being true in order to decide whether to accept or reject our alternative hypothesis. And then alternatively, the alternative hypothesis says a statement that directly contradicts the null hypothesis. We determine whether or not to accept or reject this statement based on the likelihood of the null or opposite hypothesis being true. You can define what the null hypothesis and alternative hypotheses are, but how I perceive them is that the null hypothesis is essentially that there is no significant correlation between your hypothesis and what actually happened. And then the alternative hypothesis is that there was some kind of correlation or something that is leading your hypothesis to be true. So it's not necessarily that your hypothesis is not true for the null hypothesis or is true for the alternative hypothesis. It's more like the null hypothesis is nothing happened, and the alternative hypothesis is that something happened or is correlated. That's how I perceive it. Null hypothesis assumes there is no difference between two groups. So again, light color has no effect on plant growth. But, for example, the alternative hypothesis is that light color affects plant growth. So again, that's kind of going back to either nothing is happening or something is happening. After you do or figure out what your hypothesis is, you're going to do some kind of experiment or test to figure out if you're actually right. You can guess about things all you want, but you'll never know if it's actually true or not until you try it out for yourself, right? So you do some kind of experiment. This can vary a lot from situation to situation. Not every experiment or anything with science has to do with complicated looking chemicals like you see in the picture here. Anything just about to be an experiment. Then after your experiment, you have to figure out what the experiment was telling you. So that basically means you just have to log the information that you see. And when you log that information, it's easier to figure out what that information is telling you by putting it in some kind of graph. So that graph can be seen in a bunch of different ways, just like in all these different graphs here. You'll want to pick a graph that is appropriate for whatever situation you're testing, but those just help you perceive and help others figure out what you actually found in your experiment. Then what those graphs tell you is brings you to some kind of conclusion. So it tells you something about the test that you did. Okay? Whether your hypothesis was supported or rejected, the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis was supported or rejected, and you're able to tell that from the data. Now from there, a lot of people get personal about their hypotheses. You don't need to be. It is perfectly fine for your hypothesis to be wrong. And that's okay. It's still, hopefully you did a valid experiment, and if your hypothesis is wrong, that's perfectly fine. But what's an important part of science is that you keep observing, you keep making observations, you keep making new hypotheses, you keep making new hypotheses, you keep doing more and more experiments with new variables to test. You keep collecting data because the more data you have, the better your results are going to be, the more accurate and valid they are. And then you're going to keep making conclusions. And then this whole thing, the process of the scientific method starts again and again and again. And that's how you really get to somewhere exciting and interesting from just simple observations. And that essentially is the scientific method. It's really a never-ending cycle of observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, analysis. If you look up the scientific method, you'll find some people have like 8 steps, some people have like 4 steps in the scientific method. That doesn't essentially matter how many steps you have. What matters though is just this general trend. This isn't even more like steps, it's more like a blend of going from observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, analysis, conclusion, all happening, pretty much blending and overlapping constantly. But that is essentially the scientific method. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you for watching. Please share and subscribe, and remember to just spread kindness.